Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for another webinar sponsored by X-Rite. Thank you to X-Rite Photo and Video for hosting me here today. My name is Tim Gray, and I'm a photographer and educator, and lately most of my educational materials, actually for a number of years now, my educational materials have revolved around producing video training courses. And so today we're going to be talking about video, and specifically editing 2-camera video. Obviously that could then be scaled up to 3 and 4 and 5-camera video if you'd like. I do find that many photographers are not calibrating their displays. This isn't a topic that gets as much attention as it used to, it seems to me. And so I do want to remind you how important it can be to calibrate your display. You're making decisions about tonality and color based on what you see on your display. It behooves you to make sure that that display is as accurate as possible. You can see the i1 Display Pro down here. This is the package that I actually use to calibrate my own display. It has this fancy device, a colorimeter, that measures the actual brightness values, the luminance values, as well as color values that are projected by your display, and then a profile is built. Most displays right out of the box are about a full stop too bright. In other words, twice as bright as they should be. The color is usually reasonably stable, but I always like to make sure, especially before I start a big project, I like to make sure that my color and overall luminance levels, brightness levels on the display are as accurate as possible. So if you're not calibrating, please consider calibrating that display to make sure that you're making your decisions based on an accurate view of your photos and video clips. Now, moving right along, we're going to talk about capturing multiple video clips from multiple cameras and bringing them all together. Now, in very basic concept, first off, if we just consider a simple scenario where we're looking at a video clip, here is a lovely clip of yours truly looking ever so happy holding the color checker. So this is the color checker video from X-Rite, and so that is used as a target primarily for my purposes for color, but you can also take advantage of, for example, with the Colorchecker Passport video version, there is a focusing chart on there. So a variety of benefits that you have there, but for the most part, it really relates to accurate color. Certainly it's helpful for overall tonality as well as you're making adjustments. Now, if it were just a single clip, so here I am talking about something incredibly important, of course, and so when we're looking at a video clip and playing back a video clip, we want to make sure that we're presenting a good view, and everything seems pretty good here. The audio came out reasonably fine. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And we've got a video, a setup that seems perfectly reasonable for an educational video. But as much as the content of what I'm saying might be interesting, the reality is that with a single camera, it gets a little bit boring. No matter how compelling the content of what's being said, for example, in this case, whatever the particular subject matter might be or the type of content, obviously it's not always a talking head speaking to the camera, but whatever that might be, it may be interesting all by itself, but things can get more interesting if we bring additional video angles to the mix. Now, in a very simple world, we might just have a single clip, and here I am talking to the camera, saying something wildly important. That's all well and good, but what about adding additional content? Well, if we go up just a small level in terms of complexity, then we might add pickups or B-roll. In other words, if I'm talking about how I was photographing down on the coast, then we might cut away to some stock footage of the coast, of the water, waves crashing on the rocks, or whatever it might be that I'm talking about. So something that makes sense. Or if I'm talking about a product, we could cut away to a video clip or a photo of that particular product so that I could show you what I'm talking about. And that's sort of that next level of complexity. But then we get to the multicam level of complexity. And so in this case, for example, I'll actually switch over to this version of our second camera angle. And now we have another angle that we can look at, 2 cameras, but now we've introduced an additional problem. It gets more interesting because now I can switch back and forth between the full right looking at the camera angle versus the version shot a little bit from the side, for example. But now how do I get things synchronized? And so that's one of the biggest challenges, really, is making sure that our audio is synchronized between the two cameras, and that ideally the video also matches in terms of overall tone and color. Now, to be sure, as much as possible, I try to get those things taken care of in the original capture. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about using the color checker, for example, to get accurate tonality and overall color, making sure that things are accurate, applying adjustments to your video. But your workflow goes a lot more smoothly if you can make sure that your cameras are already going to be a good match in terms of color and exposure. Now, if you are fortunate enough to be working with two cameras of the same make and model, then your work is probably, in most cases, going to be rather straightforward, because more often than not, if you've got two camera operators, for example, or if you, as the crew of one, are bouncing back and forth between those cameras, you can, in many cases, just set the exact same Kelvin color temperature and the exact same overall exposure settings in manual mode, so the same aperture, shutter speed, and ISO setting, for example, and you can probably depend on a good match between those cameras if they're the same make and model. If they're different make and model cameras, then things can be a little bit more tricky. But to the extent possible, I strongly recommend that you get the settings in camera such so that you're making sure that you always end up with video clips, individual clips from two cameras that will look as accurate as possible. So again, trying to make sure that when you are capturing in the first place, everything is as close to a perfect match as you can possibly make it, but then keeping in mind, to some extent, you can make adjustments after the fact. And so we'll see some examples of that. We'll kind of play around with a couple of different scenarios to try to make sure that you have as much flexibility in your workflow as you possibly can. So right from the start, trying to make sure that the cameras are configured the same as much as possible, that we're getting good exposure, good color right from the very start, trying to minimize all the work we have to do in post-processing. The more you get done at the time that you're actually capturing the video clips, the happier you're going to be. Now, by default, or just without even thinking of anything, just with two camera angles, suddenly we've added a degree of complexity. And so that alone creates a little bit of a challenge for ourselves, because now instead of just here is a video that came right out of the camera and I can apply a little bit of editing and then get rid of it, just go through and render that video and I'm in good shape. I don't have to worry about any of the details in terms of switching camera angles or thinking about audio per se. There will be some complexity there, but if it's just a single shot out of a single camera, the audio is part of the video file, but as soon as we add another camera, we've added complexity. And so we want to make sure that we're as organized as possible right from the start, that we keep those clips organized. And there are a variety of things we can do there, obviously, in terms of identifying the clips themselves at the time of capture. You can use a slate, for example, so that we write down, the scene name and number and what number take it is, etc. Put all of that together so that on the camera, when you're looking at the camera itself, you can, or when you're looking at the shot, you can see immediately what this actually was. So actually, coming back to a topic I'd mentioned just a moment ago, Mark's got a question here. I made mention of using a Kelvin temperature instead of a custom white balance if you have two of the same camera. Keeping in mind that a custom white balance is really just a shortcut to a specific Kelvin temperature setting for all intents and purposes. And so the key there is not so much how you're approaching that necessarily, but to make sure that they are consistent. So great question, good follow-up, because we do want to make sure that we're taking advantage of everything we can in terms of getting that color accurate. So I was referring primarily to the consistency. In other words, having the two cameras match one another. But of course, now you have to decide how are you actually achieving that color. And one of those options, naturally, that you can work on in post, as we'll see shortly here, is to use something like the Colorchecker Passport or the color checker video so that we can have a reference for neutral color. But in the camera, there are several things you can do. You can set a white balance preset. And in theory, that's perfectly fine. When it comes to video, I generally don't like taking that approach. But conceptually, you could set both cameras to a daylight setting, the preset for white balance, or to cloudy, or whatever is appropriate for the conditions. And again, as long as they're the same make and model, in theory, if they're the same make and not even the same model, it might work, but your results may vary, and I'm sure some of you have experienced that, getting different results from different camera models. So you, in theory, could use a white balance preset. Another option, kind of the next level up in terms of accuracy, would be to dial in a specific Kelvin number. And so some of you maybe have already had this experience, or you've seen other film crews where the person operating camera number 1 will call out to camera number 2, I'm at 4700 Kelvin, or whatever color temperature makes sense for the scene, and they'll make sure that they're shooting at the same Kelvin value so that the color will match. But you absolutely could use a custom white balance for that same purpose, and especially if there's a situation where, for whatever reason, the lighting from different angles is going to have a little bit of a different color temperature and you need to compensate for that, you can use an in-camera custom white balance, which by and large conceptually consists of capturing an image of something that is neutral, a blank sheet of paper, for example, or the blank frame on the Colorchecker Passport, so that you've got that neutral reference, capture the image of that neutral reference, and then set it in your camera as the source for your custom white balance. And that will have an in-camera adjustment. And again, it's essentially, for all intents and purposes, the same as dialing in a custom Kelvin value. There is a tint setting there as well to consider. But in any event, that gives you a somewhat automated, or a somewhat more controlled, you might say, way of adjusting that color in the camera. So we've got our multiple cameras, and for today, for my purposes, because I want to make it easy on myself, I am operating under the assumption that I have just a single clip, a single take that I need to work with. In reality, in the real world, things can be a lot more complicated. You might need to string together several takes, several individual clips. We might be talking about multiple scenes in a single overall video project. So let's assume you're making a feature-length motion picture. You're going to have lots and lots of individual scenes. And even an interview, something as simple as a basic interview, you might work in different segments. Every now and then you've got to take a break, and you need to find a way to kind of blend that all together seamlessly, obviously with consistent camera settings. But my point is that in the real world, you're very likely going to end up with lots and lots of clips. Some of them might be outtakes. And so how do you get organized right from the start? Well, there's a few things that I recommend there. You'll notice, first of all, me with my grumpy face here holding up that color checker. I could also be holding up a slate or a card, a whiteboard, a small whiteboard that makes reference to what project this is and the scene number and the take number, for example, whatever information is helpful. But point being, if that first frame contains the information you need, that's certainly going to help you out. You can just browse your video clips and see exactly what is what. When you see that there's a take 2, for example, you probably know that the take 1 can just be ignored for the time being. Maybe set it aside in an outtakes folder. And the other thing that I'll do, now for me personally, most of my video work does not involve an absurd amount of complexity. Usually there's individual clips that are individual lessons, for example, in some of our educational courses. And so I just need to be able to identify which clip is which as quickly as possible. So in addition to possibly using a slate to mark the clip visually, I recommend when you're going to start rolling your cameras, and I'll talk about specifically what we have in this example in a moment, but when we are rolling our cameras, then what I like to do is the very first thing, as soon as cameras are rolling, there are two things actually. Number one is to have a clear indication that everything is rolling. So let's assume that we have two cameras rolling. As soon as we hit record on camera 1, whoever's job it is to press that button calls out that camera 1 is rolling. As soon as the button on camera 2, hopefully immediately thereafter, they push the button and now camera 2 is rolling. And then as quickly as possible thereafter, because I don't want to wait and listen to a whole 5-minute conversation between the crew before I know what this clip is, very, very early in the recording of that clip, an audible mention of this is the name of the project. So here's some sample video for an X-Rite hosted webinar, and this is scene 1, take 1, so that I have that additional clue to what is what in the audio. And that's especially important because if we close this, you will see that in my folder here, I have my 2 camera angles, but I also have an audio clip. And for my personal workflow, my typical approach, because I actually want audio of good quality, and so instead of letting, for example, a digital SLR with its built-in microphone record the audio, I want audio that is recorded with a nice microphone to a nice audio recording device. And so I actually will then have an additional recording, as it were. So you might even think of this almost as 3 camera angles in a manner of speaking. 2 of them are video, 1 of them is just audio. Now the key here, one of the most important pieces of this, is that my first camera angle also has audio, my second camera angle also has audio, and then I have a separate audio clip. So the thing that binds all of these together is the audio, and this is why the slate, or if you're going low budget, a simple clap of the hands, so that we have a clear indication in the audio of where things should be synchronized so that we are able to match things up. And we'll see an example of that in just a moment. But when we are then compiling these clips, we need to very clearly identify what is what and come up with some sort of approach, some sort of method of identifying what those files are. In this case, I have the luxury of only having 1 clip that I'm working with for our purposes in terms of demonstration. And so I have 2 camera angles and I have an audio feed, but they're all part of a very simple, straightforward project. If this were a more realistic project, meaning that I have lots and lots of clips to go through, then it might be scene 1, take 1, camera 1, and scene 1, take 1, camera 2, and then we have scene 2 and onward. And so the point is to keep these clips organized. Now I like to take an extra step that arguably is unnecessary. I have this Project 1 folder that contains the clips, the audio, and the video that I'm going to edit. I set aside my original captures. So I have the exact same files in an original captures folder. Conceptually, this is not necessary because when we're working in Premiere Pro, for example, we can work non-destructively, meaning that we're not actually altering the underlying clips, we're not altering the underlying audio, we're just applying changes in the project that we're working on. But I feel better, I like the peace of mind of having my source captures set aside in this original captures folder, and then I will copy those into my project folder when I'm actually ready to start editing my video. So let's go ahead and edit the video. I wanted to show you, by the way, you've already seen the color checker video. I have just a still frame here from another video with the Colorchecker Passport. So you can see a smaller version. This actually folds upon itself, and so it's a very small package, very, very convenient for travel. The only real caveat is, as you can see, it's relatively small, and so especially with multi-camera work where you're using different camera angles and maybe different zoom settings, one of those cameras might be a wider view. Naturally, that Colorchecker Passport can get to be a little bit small in the frame depending on your overall workflow. And so the Colorchecker video, as you've already seen, is a relatively large object that I can hold up, and it's a reasonable size in the frame. The Passport is a little bit smaller, so it's a matter of balancing that convenience. For this reason, I have both of them so that when I want to make sure that I have the larger Colorchecker video, then I can have that with me, and on trips where I'm trying to travel light, I can use the Passport. So I just want to make sure that you saw what that Colorchecker Passport actually looks like. So let's go ahead and get started editing, and I'm going to show you 2 basic processes that you can use for editing your video when we have multiple camera angles. I'm going to show you first the manual approach. It involves a little bit more work, but it also gives you a little bit more control and flexibility. So as much as I might be lazy, I'm also a control freak, and so I want to make sure that I am able to exercise as much control over my project as possible. So I'm going to show you the approach that I personally prefer because I'm a control freak and I don't mind putting in a little bit of extra effort in order to be able to exercise that control. But after that, I will show you the approach you can take that's a little bit more streamlined and automated, you might say. So I'm going to go ahead and launch Premiere Pro here so that we can create a project. So this Project 1 folder that we've been looking at contains the assets for this particular project. And I'm ready now to actually create that project inside of Premiere Pro. And again, we're going to start off with a sort of manual approach for the control freaks among us. So you can see I've got this dialog where I can specify, do I want to open an existing project or create something new? I'll just click the New Project button over here on the left side, and we'll give this a name. Let's just call it Project 1, and I can choose exactly where I want to save it. So I'll click the Browse button, and then I've got these folders on my desktop, so I'll just choose to save this project file. This is my Premiere Pro project file. I've given it a name, I've specified the location, and I do like to have that project right inside the folder that contains my video clips and audio clips. Again, keeping in mind, this is a copy. This is a working copy of my files. The originals are safe somewhere else, so I don't have to worry about what sorts of things I might do along the way. If I mess something up, I always have those original captures to fall back to. And I also want to make sure the default is actually DV, meaning digital video. We want high definition there, so we'll use HDV as our capture format. Not that that's a critical issue, because we can always change our project settings later. But the point is, I'm just making a simple project. When I click OK, then the Premiere Pro interface comes up. I have all these various dialogues and essentially nothing yet, because I've just got my basic project, but I haven't brought in any of my source materials, any of my assets. You can see down here on the project panel that we get the indication that we need to import media in order to get started. So we could go to the File menu, for example, and choose Import. Notice, of course, one of the things that I often recommend, regardless of what software you're using for any purpose in your workflow or daily life, you're likely to find that there are certain tasks that you perform on a regular basis, repeatedly. And whatever those tasks are, you will see on the menu when you go to select them for the countless time. Over toward the right, there's an indication of the keyboard shortcut. So for those tasks that you're performing on a regular basis, such as importing media into your project in Premiere Pro, not a bad idea to make a mental note of the keyboard shortcut. In this case, Control-I on Windows or Command-I on Macintosh, and that will bring up the import dialog, essentially just a window, a browser window, a file open window, if you will, where we can specify the content that we want to import. And so we've already talked about what those clips are. I have my audio clip, I have camera 1, and I have camera 2. So 2 video clips and an audio clip that I'm going to merge all together, you might say, into my overall project. So I'll click on the first item there, the audio clip, and then hold the Shift key and click on the last item. In this case, that's camera 2. And I'll go ahead and click the Import button. And now we have our items over on our project bin here. And you'll see they're all obviously labeled based on the file name. But I'm not yet able to actually work directly with these clips because I don't have a timeline specified yet. Notice over on my timeline, I have the indication that I can drop media here to create a sequence. There are a variety of ways we could create a sequence, and when we take a look at the other option for multi-camera editing, I'll show you another approach that's available there. But in this case, I'm going to use this drag and drop approach. So I'll start with camera number 1. I want that to be my key camera, and so I'll just drag it from my project bin onto the timeline, which is not yet a timeline, but it is about to become a timeline, essentially. So I will drag and drop, and now you can see that things get a lot more interesting in terms of the overall interface here. And so there is my camera 1 video clip. I'll go ahead and drag camera 2. So now I need to be a little more thoughtful about where I'm dragging this clip, because I now do have a timeline. Notice that I have multiple tracks available for video and audio. I'll go ahead and take my camera 2 clip and drag and drop out onto the timeline. Now I could put it after clip 1 so that I have that on the, it's the same track, or I can put it up above onto track 2, and notice that the audio splits accordingly. So the audio and video tracks stay in sync. Now if this were scene 1 followed by scene 2, then obviously I would probably put the clip one after the other. So clip 2, in this case it's camera 2, but clip 2 would go after clip 1. But here it's actually the same clip with 2 different camera angles, and so I want those on separate video tracks, and then I'll just overlap one on top of the other. We'll talk about how we line them up properly in just a moment. And then we also have, of course, the audio track. So you'll already see that I have the video for camera 1, and that is connected to the audio from camera 1. And then I have the video from camera 2, as well as the associated audio from camera 2. Now if I go over to my project bin, I'll grab the audio clip. So now we're going to have a mismatch, if you will. We've got 2 video clips and 3 audio tracks. So now I have the 2 camera angles, of course, those 2 video clips with their associated audio, but then also a separate standalone audio clip. Now, of course, there's a good chance that a lot of this I'm going to want to work with the audio and the video and make some adjustments. I'm not going to go through an extensive workflow in terms of the details of the audio, but I do want to give you a sense of some of these possibilities. So we'll talk about the audio and video adjustments. But first, I see a question here. Can you talk briefly about file naming? Obviously, our cameras won't produce clips called camera 1 and camera 2. So what method do you use? And very, very true. In fact, most cameras are going to use the same file naming structure for video clips as they do for your still photos, assuming that we're talking about, for example, a digital SLR where you're able to capture still images or video clips. And so you're going to have some rather interesting, in some cases, file names that are not especially meaningful. For me personally, the approach that I take is to identify a project. And so whatever that project might be, it's going to have a working title or a name or a code of some sort. And then there will be individual segments. So in the typically with video we're talking about scenes versus individual takes, obviously. But really you just need to consider how is it that you think about this overall content. So for me personally, as I mentioned, a lot of the video content that I produce, I would say probably the majority of the video content that I produce are educational videos for photographers talking about photography, of course, and camera settings and maybe software and post-processing. And so for me, it is typically a course. So here is a course on photographing in Rome, Italy. And here is a course on producing creative blurs with long exposures. And so I'll assign a code to that overall project. And so in the case of my photography courses, for example, I'll use the word photo, very original, and then a sequence number, so whichever course in the category of photography, maybe this is the 12th course that I've produced in the category of photography, so it might be photo 12 dash, and then I typically break up my content, very similar to, for example, scenes and shots in movies or TV shows. For me, that breaks down into chapters and lessons. And so here's chapter 1, lesson 1, and chapter 1, lesson 2. Eventually we get to chapter 2 and so on. But then I also want to identify as part of that file name what piece of that puzzle is this. And so that would literally be very often camera 1, camera 2 if we're talking about live action with 2 camera angles. Or it might be live and screen, because sometimes that second camera angle isn't a camera at all. It's a recording of the screen. So much like with this webinar, you're able to see my screen. I can record that screen. Well, I can incorporate the recording of the screen into a video project, of course, just like any other video clip. And so my second camera angle might actually be a screen recording, and then I would include the word screen. So it might be live or live and screen, for example, as that last word of the file name, camera 1, camera 2, and then, of course, the audio. And even though the videos always include audio, naturally the audio clip itself can be just called audio because that's the purpose of that clip. So here I've sort of streamlined things a little bit to keep it simple and to keep it a little bit more clear about what is what in terms of the objects, the assets that we're actually working with. But again, the key, it's really important. I have such a simple job here today because I have 2 camera angles, 1 audio clip, all for a single shot. That's about as easy as it gets when it comes to multi-camera editing. And of course, course, I got to make this project, so I got to make it easy on myself. In the real world, naturally, things can get more complicated. So everything that we're talking about sort of gets amplified and magnified just a little bit. So here, part of the reason I want to illustrate a couple of concepts here as it relates to this approach that I personally prefer, where we're able to exercise greater control over the process. And you'll see, you'll get a better sense of why I prefer this approach later, because the approach I'll show you next is easier, to be sure, but it also doesn't give you quite as fluid a process when you need to make adjustments. So, and I'm a nitpicker and a control freak, so I want to be able to get in here and make changes. One of those is going to be the audio. Part of the reason I'm recording audio separately is because I want high quality audio, and more to the point, the built-in microphone for a digital SLR camera, for example, does not give you audio of very good quality. You could certainly use a boom mic. There are a variety of ways that you could record the audio in the camera, but in many cases, even using a really good microphone, if you're plugging it into the camera, the recording is not all that great. And so I prefer to use separate audio. That doesn't mean that the audio is 100% perfect. There's still things that need to be done to improve that audio. And so once I've got that audio onto my timeline, I can actually right-click on it and then choose to edit the clip in Adobe Audition. So I can actually essentially re-render this audio. So an additional clip is being made, essentially, and that will be opened automatically then into Adobe Audition. Now, there are countless things that you could do to this audio to really make it sing, to make it sound better, to improve the overall quality. I'm just going to show you two basic things here that I would say are definitely something you probably need to do. If I go ahead and play this clip, for example, you can see that my levels are not getting super high up there. I'd like to push that up a little bit, and so I can go to the Effects menu and go to my Amplitude and Compression menu and choose Hard Limiter, and this allows me to amplify my audio but set an upper limit so it never goes above a certain value. You can see my maximum amplitude at the moment is set to minus 0.1 decibels. I generally set this to minus 3 decibels. So if I can drag the mouse into just the right position, or I can just go in and type the value. So minus 3 decibels in terms of that peak. And then while I'm playing the clip, I can adjust how much of a boost. And you'll notice down below, if I'm constantly hitting that minus 3 limit, that means I'm going to be really clipping the top end of that audio. And so I want to set an amplification, a boost, where only the peaks are really hitting up to that minus 3 decibels. It's very common to aim for minus 12 decibels. I have a tendency to push that a little bit toward minus 6 decibels in terms of kind of the typical peak, if you will. Obviously, if I come back to this speaking segment of the audio, there's going to be a lot of variability. Even if it's the same person theoretically speaking at the same volume, different sentences when they emphasize, so you need to scrub through a fair bit of your audio to get a better sense of how much of a boost is an appropriate boost, but very straightforward. So setting that upper limit and then determining how much of an amplification of a boost is needed to bring yourself up to a better and more consistent audio level. I'll go ahead and apply that. And then the next thing that I consider to be critically important, and we're not going to go into extensive detail here, but just to give you a sense of this important step, that would be noise reduction. So trying to tone down the noise. If I go into a section of the audio, you can see the waveform here, and you can see that this little section is essentially silence. Over here, obviously, is where I was actually talking. Over here is where I was just talking with the crew, and oh, did we have this set up, and are you really rolling the audio, and whatever other things might be going on. And you can see the difference there in terms of those audio levels, by the way. When I'm just kind of talking to the crew, it's quiet. When I'm actually on and talking, then it gets a lot louder. So there's going to be a little bit of that variability. But now I've selected, I just dragged onto a section that is obviously silence, and if I play, take a look at my meters down here, and you'll see that that little clip actually has a fair bit going on. Now I've gone beyond that, obviously. But even in that little segment of silence, there is noise, and I want to reduce that. And so There are a variety of ways you could approach this. There are many plugins, but I typically just use the noise reduction, this process option under the noise reduction menu on effects. And basic process here is that we would capture the noise print. So whenever we're recording video that includes audio that we actually want to keep, we want to make sure that we roll a little bit for silence, for that ambient noise, whatever's going on in the room, so that we can try and reduce that. And part of that is, of course, related to noise, that static that you might hear in the background. And so the first thing is to select a section of our audio that has silence, and then to capture the noise print. So you see the Capture Noise Print button. We can go ahead and click that, and basically what I'm doing there is telling Adobe Audition, this is silence, and so you can use this silence to determine what is noise, because anything you hear there is something I don't want. We can then adjust our overall settings, the strength of our noise reduction, how many decibels do we want to reduce that noise by, and then essentially the percentage. So if you take a look at our noise floor here, we're able to push that up or down. And the key really is, once you've identified that noise print, you capture the noise print, select the entire file, you want to make sure, listen to the silence, but don't focus on the silence. If you adjust your noise settings so that the silence truly sounds silent, what you're probably going to find out is that the portions where someone is speaking are going to sound really, really unusual, to say the least. It gets this sort of bubbly sound to it. And so, as with, if you're familiar with noise reduction in the camera, if we've got captures, photos, still photos that were captured at a high ISO setting, and you get noise in the photo, we can't get too aggressive or we ruin the good parts of the photo as well. The same goes for audio noise reduction. So you do need to be a little bit careful. Fortunately, the tools here are quite powerful and you can get a good improvement, but don't focus on trying to eliminate completely the noise, but rather just try to tone down that noise so that it's no longer objectionable. Especially keep in mind, if it's, in this case, the example we have is spoken word. We have somebody talking, and so even if there's a little bit of noise, the voice itself is the loudest thing, and it's going to overpower that noise a little bit. So unless you have a variety of portions where the speaking pauses momentarily, and that could be just a little moment of catching your breath or thinking for just a second, and that gives us some silence for just a moment. We don't want there to be obvious problematic noise there in that little silent section. But again, we don't want to overdo it where the audio sounds bad and warbled as well. Once I've applied those adjustments, now of course there's much more. I could add echo and reverb, and I can go into my EQ settings and give myself some really good bass in the voice, and there's all sorts of things that we could do here, obviously. But let's get back to our multiple camera work. I'll just save the work that I've done here in Adobe Audition and then quit Adobe Audition. And if you take a look at my project bin over here, you can see that there's actually, in addition to my original audio clip, now I have this audio extracted, and so that is the clip that was just created as part of this process of applying those adjustments. So in this case, just amplifying a little bit and noise reduction. Now at this point, I've got my audio to the point that I'm happy with it. This camera number 1 looks pretty good. If I come over here to camera number 2, oh, I didn't have the white balance, the color temperature setting in the camera. It was not set very well, so we need to fix it. And this is, again, one of the reasons that I prefer to work in this kind of manual approach. Even though it's a little bit more work, I like the little more work because it gives me a little more control as well. And so I'm in the Lumetri setting, so I can go into my window, workspace, and color workspace. Obviously, you can configure these workspaces the way you see fit, but with the color workspace, we have access to the Lumetri color panel here. And so I'll make sure that the clip I want to work with is selected. So I can click on that clip on the timeline, and then I want to get to a segment of the clip. So I can scrub through the clip here to go find a portion where I can see my color checker video. And then I can apply a variety of adjustments, and you can see here we have our highlights and shadows, our overall exposure, etc. So we could apply a wide variety of adjustments. For now, I'll just use our white balance adjustment and maybe go in and click on a white area of that color checker to very quickly and easily fix that, the color in this case, of that video for that second camera angle. The first camera angle looks like it was perfectly fine, so we'll assume that those are a good match at this point, but naturally I could adjust each of those individually. And of course, the adjustment doesn't have to be only colors. I've mentioned we have a variety of other adjustments here as well, and we can apply those on a clip-by-clip basis. I could also save a preset, so if I want to apply the same adjustment settings to every single clip of camera number 1 versus camera number 2, for example, that's certainly an option as well. So now I feel that everything is pretty well put together where I'm happy with my results. Now let's take a look at actually lining things up, synchronizing our audio, and then making some edits so that we can switch from one camera angle to the next. Now normally what we would be doing here is to actually go through and listen to the audio, find where the clap is, and then clip each of those little segments, each of those shots, and line them all up so that we end up with the audio perfectly synchronized. So you can see here, for example, there is that clap, but I can also, if I scroll through here, if you look carefully, and if I zoomed out a little bit more, it'd be, I suppose, a little more obvious, but we can also see that we have a long segment of talking, but then we have the kind of pre-roll here, and you can see the little spike on each of our audio clips, and so we can trim based on those audio clips. And notice over on the right my meter here showing where we've gotten that clap. And so what I would typically do, obviously for our purposes right here, I don't need to play back the audio and go through all of this process, but we would normally then take a close look and listen to the audio. And what I like to do is navigate through, so position the playhead and then use the arrow keys on the keyboard to slide through that video. At the moment, I'm actually looking at paying attention to camera number 2, and there is the audio that I can see. So I'll go till I hear the sound, and then I back off by one click, one press of the left arrow, and then I'll go ahead and choose the camera 2 video clip here and press Control-K on Windows or Command-K on Macintosh to cut at that point, because I don't need anything that was before this clap, and in fact I'm going to trim beyond that. So I'll go ahead and cut, and then the portion to the left here, it is selected at the moment. I can press the delete key on the keyboard in order to delete that portion of the clip. And I'll just go through really quickly here, and let's say right about there is where we hear the clap, and then I can back off and cut camera number 1, get rid of that pre-roll that I don't need, and then here is the actual audio track. So there's our peak, and once again select it, cut it, and get rid of the stuff that I don't need, everything that came before the clap. Well, now I know where the clap is, but they're still not lined up. Fortunately, I can just drag all of those clips and get them lined up on their left edges here, so that now I can feel pretty confident that the audio, and you can see the waveform here, pretty clear indication that the matching waveforms from each microphone are indeed matching up to each other. I'm going to go ahead and select all those clips. I can just kind of click and drag, kind of like a marquee, and I'll take that all the way over toward the left end here, right about, did I get it all the way to the edge? There we are, right to the edge, so that I'm opening up with that first frame of my video clips here. And actually, I'm not quite all the way, but there we go. In any event, I can then work to fine-tune the editing, and actually there's some more trimming that I want to do here. So playing through, I can then, with all of those clips selected, once again, Control-K on Windows, Command-K on Macintosh to trim away everything else that I don't need. And now I have a really, by and large, finished product in a manner of speaking. I just haven't switched between my clips yet. Now, I still have the audio for all three, and I can listen to the video with all three audio tracks playing so that I can just audibly make sure that all of that audio really is synchronized and that it syncs up to the video so that, when I'm talking, I actually hear the same words that I'm speaking. At this point, I could just mute. So this M button over here on the timeline for each of our elements, I can click that M to mute those clips. But quite frankly, once I'm happy with my overall results in terms of synchronizing the audio, I'll just get rid of that audio that I don't actually need. So I can select my camera 1 and camera 2 clips, right-click and choose to unlink, and then I can come and delete the audio that goes with each of those videos. I like to then bring my key audio up to the timeline along with camera 1, the track that is associated with camera 1, and then I'll select both of those, right-click, and link. So now maybe I'll trim the end just to be thorough. So there we're finished. So I can cut once again and get rid of the trailing piece there. So now I have, in theory, kind of, sort of, my finished video, except I haven't switched between. I have not switched from one camera angle to the next. Keep in mind, I'm operating under the assumption that camera 1 is my key camera, so I usually want to see that, and then when I choose to add in my second camera, then I'll cut and trim and adjust accordingly. And so what I'll typically do is hide my second camera. I'll just click the eyeball icon over here to the left of the camera 2 track. When I click on that, I'm no longer seeing in my composite view that second camera angle. So naturally I would be listening as I scrub through, and whenever I talk about, whatever it is where I want to switch camera angles, in this case the audio is actually talking about different camera angles, but whenever I decide, so let's assume that I'm going to open with camera 1, with me talking directly to the camera, and then at some point I decide, oh, it would be interesting to switch to a different camera angle. Now I can trim camera number 2, that second track. In this case, I could, for example, we've already been using that cut tool, so I can Control K or Command K on the keyboard in order to cut at that position where the playhead is, and then I can just get rid of this portion of the video. Now, bear in mind, I'm not getting rid of the actual frames of that portion of the video in the video file itself. So if later I decide, oh, I would rather switch camera angles back here, I can move my playhead just as a reference and then drag the left edge of that clip into position. It's still going to be synchronized because I'm not moving the clip, I'm just adjusting the trim position. And so then I might scroll back a little bit on the timeline, re-enable the second camera angle in this case. In other words, click on that eyeball icon again, so then I can see the switch to the second camera angle. And whenever I decide that I want to switch back to camera number 1, I can cut. And once again, in this case, I would just pull back that second camera angle. And when I'm working in this fashion, once I've started trimming, then I'll generally leave the clip, my second camera angle, visible. And then whenever I decide that I want to bring back camera 2, let's say at this point I decide that I want that second camera angle, I've moved it out of the way, I can just trim back to the current playhead position, and now I've got that second camera angle. I've switched to that second camera angle. And then at some point I decide that, I'm all finished, I don't need camera number 2 anymore, I'm going to close out the clip talking to the camera. But again, obviously the content might vary, but the basic process here is the same. And part of the reason that I like this approach, as I've mentioned, is that I'm a control freak. I like to be able to exercise more control. If I find there was a problem with the audio, I can send it back to Adobe Audition again. If I need to apply some adjustments to a clip, I can certainly do that, etc. So I'll go ahead and save this project just for fun, and then I'll quit, and we will actually take a look at a second project. So this is where I'm going to show you the easier approach. It doesn't give you as much flexibility, but it certainly is much easier, and there's some automated advantages here as well. With this approach that I'm about to show you, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you ensure that your audio and video are in great condition before you get started in Premiere Pro. Now this, as I mentioned, is always sort of important. I want to make sure that the color is good and the exposure is good and that my audio is nice and clean, but it's especially important. We've already seen here today how we can go in and adjust the color for our clips, and we can adjust the audio and do noise reduction, etc. When it comes to this workflow that I'm going to show you, I really strongly recommend, I think you'll find it much, much easier and more pleasant with fewer potential problems if you make sure that the clips are color corrected in advance and that your audio has had noise reduction applied in advance, and you save those out, you render those out so that you can use them in your project. And what I often find is that when this approach that I'll show you here in just a moment is used, it's very often used in situations where somebody who is an expert at audio and video in terms of color and tone and noise reduction, for example, that person is doing the initial processing, and then somebody else, maybe somebody in the creative department or the marketing department, that other person is going to choose when to switch camera angles. Those are the types of workflows where I find this to be most useful, but naturally you could use this workflow yourself. In large part, it's just a matter of personal preference. So we'll go ahead and create another project. Now here, we're really just adding a couple of additional pieces, so this will just take a moment in terms of seeing the variation on how we would work. And as you'll see, it is in many ways a much more streamlined approach. So once again, we're going to create a project. So inside of Premiere Pro, once I've launched it, I'll choose that new project option, and I'll save it into that Project 2 folder that I have out on my desktop. So I'll go to the desktop and choose Project 2 as my location where I'll save my project, and I'll be ever so clever and very thoughtful here and call it Project 2, very original. So same basic settings as we saw before, just giving it a name and a location to save the actual project out on my hard drive. And then I'm going to import media once again, so I'm in my Project 2 folder, and I'll go ahead and choose those options. Notice in this case, I've corrected camera 2, so I just added corrected there just so it would be clear to us that it has already been corrected. But now I'm not taking anything to the timeline just yet. Instead, I'm going to create a multi-camera sequence here. So I'm going to right-click on my clip here. In this case, I'm right-clicking on camera 1 and choose the Create Multi-Camera Source Sequence. Whenever we're working inside of Premiere Pro, it's not immediately obvious, and many people who have been using Premiere Pro for a while aren't even really aware of the sequence, but whenever we're actually working with video inside of Premiere Pro, we are working with a sequence that defines the settings for that overall sequence. Here, those settings will relate to a multi-camera capability. You can see the default here is to just call it multicam. We can actually synchronize based on audio. So I might have added markers to my clips so that I can mark the clap point, for example, my in point, but I can also have Premiere Pro automatically synchronize based on the waveform of the audio, which is obviously very convenient. I can choose which track to do that based on. And then I can also choose whether I want to move the clips to a process clips bin. That's just an organizational tool, so I'll leave that turned on. And then the camera names, I'll just enumerate them. You can see that the sequence settings are being pulled from camera 1, my primary camera angle. So that all looks good. I'll go ahead and click OK. And now, once that processing is completed, over on the left side, you'll see that there is that process clip. So remember the bin that we referred to, that folder. And then we have a sequence, our multi-camera sequence. So now it is the multi-camera sequence that I want to drag out onto my timeline. And then I'll get out to the point, and certainly I could trim in the normal way, but more importantly, the part that I want to add for our purposes right now, I'm going to switch into my editing workspace here rather than color. And then below my preview, right now I'm looking at the composite, which means show me what the actual result looks like. Show me the finished product, essentially, in terms of the video while I'm working. If I click my little wrench icon down here below my preview area on the program panel, then I can choose the multi-camera option so that I can actually edit in multi-camera mode. And now you'll see, thankfully, I've kept my project simple for my benefit today, but I have only those 2 camera angles, so I can see thumbnails for the 2 camera angles as well as the composite video over toward the right, and I can see which camera angle is active at the moment. So again, I can now go through, and we start on camera number 1, of course, just as we saw previously, and at any point, while the video is actually playing, if I'd like, I can specify that I want to switch to camera number 2. So I'll go ahead and keep it playing, and then I can press the number 2 on the keyboard in order to switch to camera number 2. And then if I want to switch back to camera number 1 at whatever point, I'll just scrub forward just a little bit here, for example, and then I can press 1 in order to switch to camera number 1. Now, as I'm doing that, the video is actually being trimmed. Really, it's my project here that is being adjusted, my sequence that's on the timeline. So notice this has been streamlined and simplified for my purposes. I'm going to go ahead and switch back into my composite video option here rather than the multi-camera view, and we'll go back on our timeline. I'll zoom in just a little bit, and you can see that once I start playing back, there's camera number 1, and there's camera number 2, and then in a moment here we switch back to camera number 1. Well, I've done that just by pressing the number 1 or 2 for the camera angle on the keyboard to switch back and forth, but what if I wasn't quite quick enough pushing that button on the keyboard, and now I decide that I want to change the trim point, change the point at which I'm switching from one camera to the next? Very simple. So let's assume that I want that camera 2 to be visible for a little bit longer. You can see the trim point right here on the timeline. All I need to do is to adjust the trim. However, one important additional piece, I need to hold the Control key on Windows or the Command key on Macintosh so that I'm not actually separating these clips, I'm actually adjusting their position. So you can see that, well, quadruple arrowed vertical bar to indicate that now I can adjust that trim point and both of my video clips will adjust accordingly. There's a nice facial expression for the ending of camera number 2, but then I can switch that position. So I can drag back and forth. So again, holding Control key on Windows, Command key on Macintosh, and I can adjust exactly where I want that trim point to be. Notice on my program panel, I can see the view on the left there is camera number 2, and on the right is camera number 1. So I can see exactly where I'm going to be switching. So very often, for example, I'll want to switch at a particular gesture. Maybe I make a hand gesture referencing something, and that's the point where I'll switch to another camera angle, or whatever the case might be. Obviously, again, all of the details here depend on the type of project that you're actually working on. But the key is really to be as organized as possible and to have a sense of these various options for working with multiple camera angles inside of Premiere Pro. As I mentioned, again, I do prefer that control freak approach of being able to manually control everything, but the multicam editing features inside of Premiere Pro actually can make that process very, very simple and easy as well. So it is a task potentially that can be all sorts of complicated, but if you're thoughtful about how you're capturing the video and the audio in the first place, how you're organizing your individual clips as part of your project, and then how you're approaching that actual project in Premiere Pro, I think you'll find that it can actually be relatively straightforward to edit multi-camera video inside of Premiere Pro. And if I'm being honest, it can actually be a lot of fun as well, choosing exactly the point where you want to switch from one camera angle to another, for example. So again, thank you very much for all of you for joining today. I hope you found this enjoyable and informative and helpful for your own workflow in terms of video production. Thank you once again to X-Rite for hosting today's webinar presentation. Thank all of you for joining me today, and I'll hope to see you again on a future webinar presented by X-Rite. Thanks very much.